Lord Peter Wimsey had always said that London, for all its wickedness, rarely surprised him any more. But that was before the night Inspector Charles Parker telephoned, his voice strained in a way that instantly straightened Wimsey in his armchair. The call came just after 11, when the fog was dense enough to blur even the nearest street lamps, and the city seemed to breathe in slow, uneasy pulses. "Peter, we've got something at the Belhaven apartments. I can't make head or tail of it." Wimsey did not bother with his coat. Bunter thrust it at him the moment he rose. The drive across town was silent save for the occasional hiss of tires sliding over damp cobblestones. At the entrance of Belhaven, a grand but decaying block on the Strand, Parker stood waiting, cap pulled low, the yellow glow of the lobby light sharpening the worry on his face. "It's a locked room case," Parker said quietly as they climbed the stairs. "But not like any I've seen." Locked rooms, Wimsey thought, were like cryptic crossword clues, difficult but rarely insoluble. He expected the usual: a burglar too nimble for the police, a suicide carefully staged, a trick with windows or keys, but one glance at the victim's apartment dispelled all such hopes. The flat belonged to Sir Lionel Chard, a well-known barrister who had argued some of the Crown's most intricate cases. He now lay slumped over his writing desk, head bowed as though in contemplation, a deep crimson stain spreading across the back of his shirt. The wound was clean, almost surgical, and unmistakably fatal, but it was everything else in the room that made Wimsey's breath catch. The desk chair was perfectly positioned, nothing was overturned or out of place. The window was latched from the inside. The door had been forced only by the constable who discovered the body. No sign of a struggle, no murder weapon. No fingerprints but the victim's. But the strangest element of all was the object sitting precisely at Sir Lionel's right hand, a single white chess pawn. Wimsey leaned in, careful not to disturb the crime scene. The pawn was polished to a sheen, identical to thousands found in any parlour set, yet its placement suggested purpose. Sir Lionel's hand pointed toward it, fingers slightly curled, as though he had been reaching for it, or away from it, at the moment of death. Parker exhaled sharply. "There's no chessboard in the flat, no sets in any drawer. His housekeeper swears he never played. Everyone plays something," Wimsey murmured, eyes drifting to the bookshelves lined with thick legal volumes. "The question is, was this his first game, or his last?" He moved through the flat slowly, absorbing every detail. A newspaper folded neatly on the table, a bottle of ink uncapped, a half-finished letter in Sir Lionel's precise handwriting. The words halted abruptly in mid-sentence. "And if my suspicions are correct, then nothing more." The killer had left no footprints, no fibres, no scent of gunpowder, no weapon, no sign of forced entry, no conceivable reason for Sir Lionel to allow someone inside, let alone lower his guard. The man was cautious by reputation, meticulous in personal affairs, even rumoured to be paranoid. Wimsey turned back to the body. "Time of death? Between 9:30 and 10, Parker said. "Housekeeper was out buying groceries. Neighbour in the next flat claims she heard nothing. Constable on evening patrol swears no one came up or down the stairwell. Elevator? Out of order for 2 weeks. So we have an impossibility," Wimsey said. "Or something masquerading as one." He examined the lock on the apartment door. It was the old pin-tumbler type, reliable but hardly invulnerable. Still, even if someone had picked it, how had they relocked it from the inside? No key lay near the body, and the only one found had been in Sir Lionel's pocket. Parker rubbed his temples. "If you can solve this one, Peter, I'll buy you a year's worth of that awful coffee you like." Wimsey smiled faintly but remained focused. A locked room puzzle usually hinged on a single overlooked detail, a hinge, a hidden passage, a timed mechanism. But Belhaven was too old and too straightforward for such theatrics. The building manager swore there were no hidden routes or forgotten service shafts. "What of Sir Lionel's cases?" Wimsey asked. "We checked. Nothing recent that looks dangerous. His last trial ended 2 weeks ago, a financial fraud, no violence involved, and personal enemies? That list could fill a cathedral. Barristers collect grudges like stamps." Wimsey drifted back to the desk. The pawn sat innocently beneath the lamplight. He picked it up using a handkerchief, turning it slowly. No markings, no initials, no weight anomalies, just smooth wood. Odd place for a pawn to end its journey, he said. Unless it was meant to start one. He set it down and scanned the shelves again. Something pricked his memory, an old case of misdirection involving a symbolic object. Killers loved theatrics, especially when cleverness outweighed practicality. Parker, did Sir Lionel ever play chess with his clients? Perhaps as a metaphor. Some barristers. He didn't entertain clients at home, Parker cut in. Too private. Wimsey crouched beside the writing desk. The ink bottle's position bothered him. The cap was off, yet there were no splatters, no smudged words on the unfinished letter. A man startled by an attacker would have knocked something over, but nothing here. Poor signs of interruption. Unless Sir Lionel never saw the killer. Could he have been writing to you? Parker asked suddenly. Not likely, Wimsey said. Our correspondence rarely concerned suspicions, unless related to wine quality. They shared a brief, humorless laugh. Bunter appeared at the doorway, having finished his quiet sweep of the surrounding halls. My lord, he said softly, I found something curious behind a radiator on the landing. He held out another chess piece, a black knight, its edges chipped from age. Parker blinked. What the devil? It was lodged deep, Bunter continued. Wouldn't have fallen there naturally. Wimsey's eyes sharpened. So the game extends beyond the room. 2 pieces, a white pawn inside, a black knight outside. A message, a sequence, or simply a distraction? Wimsey pocketed his thoughts and returned to the corpse. The position of the body, the calmness of the room, it all suggested either intimate trust or complete ignorance. But Sir Lionel trusted no one. If he had opened the door voluntarily, the person must have been someone he couldn't refuse. A colleague, a superior, a family member. No photographs decorated the apartment, no mementos. Sir Lionel lived a life stripped bare of sentiment, but the unfinished sentence in his letter hinted at fear or urgency. Wimsey looked at Parker. We must find whom he was writing to. Already sent it to the lab, Parker replied. But without the envelope, yes, but the phrasing, if my suspicions are correct, it means he was close to uncovering something. Something dangerous enough to cost him his life. Wimsey stood, pacing slowly. The fog outside pressed against the window like a living thing, and the apartment felt smaller by the minute. What bothers me, he said quietly, is that nothing in this room reflects the chaos of murder. It feels almost staged. Every detail placed why? Intention. The killer wanted us to see this exactly as it is, and the pieces, a flourish, or a warning. Parker frowned. A warning to whom? Wimsey met his friend's gaze. To me, the room fell utterly silent. Wimsey picked up the pawn again and studied it with a new unease. This is no random token. Someone is inviting me to play. And they have already made the first move. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Parker swallowed. You think he knew you'd be here? Oh, undoubtedly, Wimsey said softly. This crime wasn't meant to confuse the police. It was meant to draw me into it. Sir Lionel's death is the opening gambit. He set the pawn down with deliberate care. And I, Parker, he murmured, have just touched the board. Wimsey left the Belhaven apartment with Parker close at his heels, the fog outside thickening, curling around the street lamps, and muffling the distant clatter of carriage wheels. Even the familiar scent of damp London soot seemed charged with tension, as though the city itself were holding its breath. The 2 men walked silently toward Wimsey's car, their minds occupied with the puzzle of Sir Lionel Shard's death, each step measured and deliberate. Peter, Parker said at last, breaking the quiet, do you truly think this was aimed at you? That the killer intended you to take the bait? Wimsey glanced at him, a faint, inscrutable smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It is seldom the case that the police discover such subtle provocations, Parker. A killer who sets a trap like this does not merely want the victim dead. They want someone to see, to recognize, perhaps even to complete the story. The pawn is a signal. But what kind of message requires a white pawn inside the apartment and a black knight lodged behind a radiator? Parker shivered. A warning, a challenge? Both, Wimsey said, adjusting his scarf. and more, possib. But first, we must observe more closely than anyone else. That is how these things unravel. By the time they reached his flat in Harley Street, Wimsey had already begun mentally retracing the sequence of events at Belhaven. He insisted Parker sit and recount everything he had seen, every minor detail from the room, every word spoken by the housekeeper, every unusual sound in the hallway. As Parker recounted the morning's events, Wimsey's keen eyes darted across the room, noticing how Bunter had left the tea tray slightly askew, and how the papers on Wimsey's own desk were stacked with almost ritualistic care. Even in the familiar orderless chaos of his flat, Wimsey's attention picked up minute discrepancies. An envelope out of place, a pen rotated differently from the others, a faint scuff mark on the floor. "Observe, Parker," Wimsey said, tapping the floor near the bookcase. "It is the small inconsistencies, the tiny aberrations from normality, that reveal the hand of calculation. The rest is theatrics." He spent the remainder of the morning examining every piece of evidence again, beginning with the pawn and knight. The white pawn, now in his palm, felt weightless, ordinary, almost trivial. Yet its simplicity belied the intent behind it. He held it up to the light and turned it slowly, eyes narrowing. Something about its polish, the way the light glinted off the curves, reminded him of an old trick, a reflection used in signaling, a subtle communication meant for those with the wit to see it. "And yet," Wimsey murmured, "we have no board, no game, no apparent opponent. A signal without context is a message lost." Bunter entered with tea and placed the tray down. Wimsey accepted it mechanically, his mind still on the Belhaven apartment. "Has the laboratory sent any preliminary results?" he asked. Parker shook his head. "Nothing yet. They're running Prince track. Yes, but so far it's all negative." "Not surprising," Wimsey said. "A clever killer leaves traces for the casual observer, none for the perspicacious one. It is not the police who will see this through, Parker. It is we." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was the housekeeper from Belhaven, Mrs. Thorne, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her hands trembled as she entered, and Wimsey immediately noticed the way her eyes flicked toward Parker with an unnatural hesitation. "Mrs. Thorne," Wimsey said gently, "come in. We only wish to understand more about Sir Lionel's last hours. Please, take a seat." She obeyed, but her movements were stiff, almost ritualistic, as though trying to maintain a composure she did not feel. Wimsey studied her quietly. Her gloves were immaculate, despite the damp fog outside, and there was a faint scent of lavender masking the more usual odors of coal and smoke. "You were the first to find him," Wimsey said, his voice soft, coaxing. "Tell us everything you remember." Mrs. Thorne swallowed hard. I went out for groceries, as I always do. I returned at 10:15, and that's when I found the door, unlocked. I knocked, but no answer. Then her voice faltered. Wimsey leaned slightly forward, noting her hesitation. "You left the door unlocked?" he asked, his tone neutral, almost conversational. Mrs. Thorne shook her head quickly. No, I mean, I didn't know why it was locked. I used my spare key. I found him at the desk, Lord Peter. I called the police immediately." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. "Did anyone else have access to the flat? Family, friends, neighbors?" Only Lady Chard," she said after a pause, "but she is away in the country." He observed her carefully, noting the slight twitch in her left hand as she said the word away. Wimsey's intuition prickled. Something about that hesitation, however minor, seemed deliberate. "Mrs. Thorne, did Sir Lionel ever receive visitors unannounced?" he asked. "Never. He was very private." She paused, then added softly, "though he did meet someone in the evening sometimes. A gentleman in a dark coat, always brief visits, never said who." Parker frowned. "Why didn't you mention this before?" She shook her head. I didn't think it important. I didn't even know if I should say." Wimsey nodded thoughtfully. "Every detail matters, Mrs. Thorne, even the things we think trivial." He made a small note in his mind, a mysterious visitor, brief evening meetings, the housekeeper's sudden nervousness. The pattern was beginning to form, faint as a sketch, but already more revealing than any report could provide. After she left, Whimsey returned to the chess pieces. He laid them on the table before him, white pawn and black knight, and stared for a long moment. Something about their placement, the stark contrast of colours, the symbolism of pawn and knight, struck him. Pawns were expendable, often used to lure the unwary. Knights moved unpredictably, capable of striking in ways others cannot anticipate. The killer was speaking in the language of chess, a language of strategy and concealment, and there, Whimsey said quietly to Parker, we have our first whisper of deception. He gestured toward the window. Look beyond the obvious, Parker. It is often the innocent, misplaced object that carries the true message. The pawn inside, the knight outside, the letter left unfinished, all are signals. Whoever planned this wanted someone to notice, and notice, we have. Parker leaned in, following Whimsey's gaze. So the killer didn't merely wish to conceal, they wished to communicate. Exactly, Whimsey said. Now we must determine to whom and why. He paused, fingers drumming on the table. We are no longer merely investigating. A death. We are engaging in a subtle conversation with the person who orchestrated it. The first sign of real deception, Whimsey realized, was not in the murder itself. It was in the way the crime had been staged, the way the pieces had been arranged, the careful attention to detail that seemed almost polite. A casual observer would see only a locked-room puzzle. Only someone with a keen eye would see the taunt, the invitation, the first move of a dangerous game, and Peter Whimsey intended to accept it. He rose, pacing slowly around the flat, eyes flicking from one object to another, reading the silent signals in the arrangement of furniture, the slight irregularities in the daily routine, the faint impressions left by a visitor who had vanished as completely as smoke. The challenge begins, Parker, he said, voice low, and we must be alert for every nuance. In these subtle cues, we may find the path to our killer, or to the next piece on the board. As the fog pressed closer against the windows of Harley Street, Whimsey's mind raced, each clue, each hesitation, each misplaced object, small though they seemed, spoke of intention, of calculation, of an intelligence confident in its concealment. The game had begun, and Peter Whimsey, as ever, was determined to see it through to the final, inevitable checkmate. The next morning dawned grey and oppressive, the London fog lingering like a damp curtain over the streets. Whimsey and Parker arrived at Belhaven Apartments just as the housekeeper, Mrs. Thorne, opened the lobby door. She had been instructed to gather anyone who might have knowledge of Sir Lionel's recent interactions, neighbours, delivery personnel, and those who had last seen him alive. As the group assembled in the small, dimly lit lobby, Whimsey's sharp eyes scanned each face, noting subtle signs of unease, a twitch here, a forced calm there, a glance that lingered too. Long on the floor. The first to speak was Miss Gladys Fairchild, a young woman living directly across the hall from Sir Lionel. Her hands were clasped tightly, her posture rigid as she recounted the previous evening. I didn't hear anything unusual, she began, voice wavering. I went to bed around 9. I may have heard a door close, but it could have been anyone. Whimsey noticed her gaze flicking to Mrs. Thorne several times, and the brief hesitation in her speech betrayed more than she admitted. You are certain? He pressed gently. No visitors? No unusual noises? She shook her head firmly, but the nervous blink that followed contradicted her words. Next was Mr. James Abernathy, a middle-aged clerk who delivered mail to the building. He had a habit of speaking quickly, as though in fear of being interrupted. I brought letters to Sir Lionel at 10 o'clock exactly. I didn't see anyone else in the hall. The door to his apartment was locked. Nothing seemed amiss, he said, his voice rehearsed, almost too precise. Whimsey, however, noticed the faint smudge of ink on Abernathy's cuff, a detail inconsistent with his neat appearance. Did you place any letters inside his apartment yourself? Whimsey asked, voice soft, encouraging clarity. Abernathy's eyes flicked to Parker before he answered. No, of course not. I might have slipped one under the door once before, but last night I didn't. I swear. Whimsey's gaze lingered on him, unblinking. Very well. Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. That will be all for now. As the witnesses left the lobby one by one, a sense of contradiction began to form in Whimsey's mind. Each version of events seemed plausible in isolation, yet the details, when compared, revealed subtle inconsistencies, timings that didn't quite match, gestures that contradicted statements, nervous tics that betrayed concealed truths. Parker frowned. It's mad. Ening. Everyone seems honest, yet the story keeps shifting under scrutiny. Precisely, Wimsey said, pacing slowly. Maddening is the point. A carefully constructed deception is designed to frustrate the untrained eye. The truth is always hidden beneath the veneer of civility. They moved next to Lady Chard, Sir Lionel's estranged cousin, who had returned to London upon hearing the news. She appeared composed, but Wimsey detected the slightest tremor in her hands as she recounted her journey from the countryside. I arrived late last night. I had a carriage breakdown near Holborn, but I hurried straight here. And you had no contact with Sir Lionel in the days prior? Wimsey asked, watching her closely. None that I recall, she replied smoothly, though the faint purse of her lips suggested she had, in fact, remembered something inconvenient. Wimsey noted the detail without comment, filing it away for future consideration. A brief knock at the lobby door announced the building manager, Mr. Halstead, a man of considerable girth and even more considerable caution. I came as soon as I heard, he said, brushing down his coat. Belhaven's tenants are usually well behaved, but I noticed a stranger lingering in the hallways about a week ago. Never saw him again. Tall, dark coat, hat pulled low. Wimsey's eyes narrowed. Did anyone else see him? Halstead shook his head. No. Perhaps it was nothing. Or perhaps, Wimsey said softly, it was the opening move in a game that has now claimed Sir Lionel. After Halstead left, Wimsey turned to Parker. Notice how eager some are to provide details, while others hesitate. Each reaction has meaning. The overeager often conceal, the hesitant may reveal. The trick is to distinguish the signal from the noise. The postman's account, combined with Halstead's, painted an intriguing picture. A stranger had been present in the build-in recently, and yet none of the regular tenants admitted noticing him. Wimsey felt the threads begin to intertwine. The housekeeper's subtle avoidance, Miss Fairchild's nervous glances, Abernathy's too perfect recollection, Lady Chard's fleeting unease, and Halstead's half-forgotten visitor. Each might be truthful in part, yet each withheld some portion of the story. Wimsey requested a second round of questioning, beginning with Mrs. Thorne once more. Tell me exactly who visited Sir Lionel in the last week, he instructed gently. Her eyes widened, and she bit her lower lip. Only one gentleman, not often. Perhaps twice, always at night, always brief. And his appearance? Wimsey asked. Dark coat, hat low. I never saw his face clearly. I tried not to. Did Sir Lionel ever speak of him? Wimsey asked. Mrs. Thorne hesitated. He seemed cautious, sometimes worried. He mentioned that he suspected someone of tampering with his papers. I did not understand fully. Wimsey leaned back, rubbing his chin. Interesting. There is a thread here. One visitor appearing under cover, influencing the household indirectly. Perhaps the white pawn and black knight are not simply theatrical. Perhaps they indicate an intrusion of this exact nature. Parker frowned. A single visitor could not have committed the murder alone, could he? The door was locked, the room undisturbed. He would need an accomplice or an ingenious method, Wimsey said softly. Notice the deception in these testimonies, Parker. Each one conceals a fragment. Only by aligning these fragments can we begin to see the truth. He moved to the window and looked out at the fog, a chill running down his spine. The city seemed indifferent, yet Wimsey's mind thrummed with the rhythm of observation, the cadence of deduction. Voices of deception were all around him, the hurried, the hesitant, the careful, and withy. Those voices, he sensed a pattern, the faint echo of calculated timing, of subtle influence, of messages hidden within the ordinary. Parker, he said at last, turning, our work now is to disentangle the narrative. Each witness carries a piece of the story, but none sees the whole. We must listen not only to their words, but to what they do not say. That is where the game truly begins. Parker nodded, weary but determined. And the first move has already been made. Indeed, Wimsey replied, eyes narrowing on the chess pieces before him, and every deceptive voice we encounter will serve as both obstacle and guide. We must treat each account as a puzzle, each pause as a hint, each misstatement as a deliberate misdirection. Only then can we begin to reconstruct the path to our murderer. As the fog lingered thick and unyielding outside Belhaven, Wimsey returned to his notes. Contradictions, omissions, and subtle gestures began to form a map, invisible to anyone not trained to see. He laid out each witness statement, cross-referenced details, and allowed his mind to wander along the faint trails of deception. Every hesitation, every glance, every rushed answer revealed a shadow of intention. Somewhere within the tangled web, the truth waited, patient as a predator, and Peter Wimsey intended to find it. Wimsey sat in the quiet of his study, the chess pieces before him catching the pale morning light through the high window. The fog had lifted slightly from the streets outside, but the pall of mystery surrounding Sir Lionel Chard's death had only thickened. Each witness, each carefully observed hesitation, each subtle contradiction, had now revealed a fragment of human desire, fear, ambition, jealousy, or greed. The tangled web of motives stretched across London like a shadow, and Wimsey was determined to trace its strands until they converged upon the perpetrator. He began with Lady Chard, whose composed demeanour masked layers of tension. The estrangement from Sir Lionel was well known, though it had been amicable on the surface. Yet Wimsey noted the faint tremor in her voice when she recounted her arrival in town, and the almost imperceptible hesitation when questioned about recent interactions. Was it simply nervousness, or did it hint at something darker, an unspoken grievance perhaps, or a financial interest in Sir Lionel's affairs? Her alibi was technically sound, an overnight carriage mishap, but Wimsey had long suspected that inconvenience could be conveniently exploited by the crafty. Then there was Miss Gladys Fairchild, who had been living across the hall. The young woman's nervous glances and over-earnest denials spoke of more than fear. They hinted at knowledge she was reluctant to share. Was it loyalty to Sir Lionel, fear of a neighbour, or a hidden motive of her own? Wimsey noted that her family connections and proximity provided both opportunity and subtle influence. She had seen and heard more than she admitted. Abernathy, the clerk who delivered mail, presented a different type of enigma. His careful, almost obsessive recollection of times and letters suggested someone who desired to appear meticulous and reliable. Yet Wimsey could not ignore the smudge of ink on his cuff and the faint scent of lavender that lingered after him. It was a minor detail, almost insignificant, but Wimsey understood that in matters of human deception, small inconsistencies often concealed profound truths. What was Abernathy protecting, or hiding? The mysterious visitor, glimpsed by Halstead, the building manager, added another layer. The tall figure in the dark coat had passed largely unnoticed until now, yet Halstead's admission that he lingered in the hallways a week prior suggested premeditation. Who was this visitor, and why had he appeared? Only briefly, leaving no trace. A threat, a warning, or a test? Wimsey suspected that the black night lodged behind the radiator in Sir Lionel's apartment was a token signalling this intruder, the unpredictable agent whose moves dictated much of the subsequent drama. As Wimsey examined these threads, he realized that motive alone would not unravel the mystery. Each suspect had reason to wish Sir Lionel harm, but the reasons did not align neatly. Lady Chard could benefit financially and emotionally, yet she had no proven means to access the locked apartment. Miss Fairchild might have sought attention, influence, or the protection of secrets, but her motive seemed juvenile compared to the calculated nature of the crime. Abernathy had the ability to tamper with letters, perhaps even messages, yet his potential gain remained unclear. The visitor remained the most elusive, a shadow threading through everyone's alibi and story. Wimsey turned to Parker, who had been quietly reviewing witness statements. "See here," he said, tapping a sheet of notes. "The timings overlap oddly. Fairchild says she went to bed at 9, Abernathy delivered letters at 10, Halstead noticed the visitor a week prior. Yet Thorne remembers only brief encounters. It's as though each person exists in a slightly different narrative. The murder itself may have been the point where all these narratives intersected." Parker frowned. You mean the crime is less about the victim and more about the interplay of these people? Exactly, Wimsey replied. Each person carries a thread of motivation. Fear, jealousy, ambition, these create a labyrinth. Our task is to find the path through it, to understand which motives intersect and which are mere distractions. He returned to the unfinished letter found at Sir Lionel's desk, reading the halting words aloud. And if my suspicions are correct, then— Wimsey ped his finger against the page. These words were not just incomplete, they were intentional. Sir Lionel had discovered something dangerous, something worth the risk of death. That knowledge, Wimsey reasoned, must intersect with the motives of those around him. Lady Chard's potential gain, Miss Fairchild's presence, Abernathy's meticulousness, and the shadowy visitor all formed concentric circles around a central secret. The detective considered the possibility that each acted with knowledge or fear of the others. Perhaps Lady Chard had coerced Fairchild into silence. Perhaps Abernathy acted as intermediary, delivering a message that should never have reached Sir Lionel. Perhaps the visitor was the instigator, using the others as pawns in a larger game. Wimsey's thoughts drifted to the chessboard, still invisible in the arrangement of clues. The white pawn inside the apartment and the black knight outside were symbolic of this very web of manipulation. The pawn, innocent, expendable, might represent Fairchild or even Abernathy, used unwittingly to lure the victim into a trap. The knight, unpredictable, capable of sudden action, suggested the shadowy visitor, whose presence disrupted the entire equilibrium. He rose, walking to the window and staring down at the fog-draped street. In these tangled motives, Wimsey realized opportunity and intent were not always matched. Some had the motive but lacked the means, others had the means but lacked the motive. Only by mapping both could he locate the fulcrum of the crime, the person whose actions intersected with every other thread and created the perfect opening for murder. Returning to his notes, Wimsey began cross-referencing each alibi with known timings and behaviors. Lady Chard's overnight journey placed her out of the immediate scene, yet it did not exclude her from orchestrating events from a distance. Fairchild's proximate. He allowed observation, subtle interference, and perhaps even communication. Abernathy's access to letters suggested a channel of manipulation, while the visitor remained a wild card whose fleeting presence demanded scrutiny. Parker observed the chess pieces again, seeing them anew through Wimsey's lens. It's as if the killer's strategy is embedded in these symbols, he said. Each move calculated, each actor positioned precisely. Yes, Wimsey replied. The pawn sacrifices, the knight maneuvers. The game is not merely about removing the victim, it is about drawing us, the investigators, into the pattern. And the pattern will reveal motive, opportunity, and ultimately identity. He paused, tapping a pen against his desk. Notice how each person's actions reveal a concealed objective. Lady Chard's composure, Fairchild's hesitation, Abernathy's over-precision, Thorne's guarded disclosure, they are all signals. Only by synthesizing them can we see the larger design. As the morning waned, Wimsey began to sketch the invisible web connecting each suspect to the crime. Lines of potential influence, threads of jealousy, strands of fear, all converged upon the point of Sir Lionel's last night. The detective realized that uncovering the motive maze would require not just observation, but active testing, subtle provocations to elicit truths hidden beneath polite lies. "Parker," he said finally, voice low and deliberate, "we now know that every suspect had reason to act, but no single motive explains everything. That, I suspect, is exactly what the killer intended. Confusion is a tool. Only by untangling the web can we determine which thread is the one that was pulled to commit murder. And that thread, I believe, will lead us directly to the mastermind." Outside, the fog had lifted entirely, leaving the streets slick with rain and London bathed in pale, cold light. But inside Wimsey's mind, the maze of motives stretched endlessly, a puzzle of human desire and cunning. Each clue, each observation, each subtle contradiction brought him closer to understanding. Yet the complexity only deepened the intrigue. The detective allowed himself a thin smile. The game was far from over, but the pattern was emerging, and Peter Wimsey, as always, intended to see it through. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, as breakthroughs often do in criminal investigations, quiet, understated, and seemingly inevitable once it arrived. The laboratory had returned preliminary findings from Sir Lionel's apartment, a partial fingerprint lifted from the ink bottle, faint but identifiable. Abernathy, the clerk, was the owner. Parker received the news with triumph, arriving at Wimsey's flat, waving the lab report as though it were a flag of victory. "Peter, it's him. The fingerprint. He's our man," Parker exclaimed, his voice brimming with relief. "All that meticulousness, and he leaves this trace. I knew it was too perfect to last." Wimsey took the paper, reading the scrawled notes from the lab. The print was indeed Abernathy's, clear enough to match the files on record. A subtle smile tugged at Wimsey's lips, but his eyes, as always, remained discerning, analytical. "Yes," Wimsey said softly, "Abernathy's print is present. That much is indisputable. But notice what it tells us, and what it does not. A fingerprint alone proves presence, not culpability. Presence does not equal guilt, especially in a scenario as intricately arranged as this." Parker frowned, clearly unsettled. "But it's compelling. He delivered letters to the apartment, had access, and now his print is there. Isn't that enough?" "Enough to justify suspicion, perhaps," Wimsey replied, "but not enough to declare the case solved. The killer, Parker, has anticipated such conclusions. They depend on our eagerness to accept the simplest explanation. And this, I fear, is a trap disguised as victory. Despite Wimsey's caution, the police moved quickly. Abernathy was summoned for questioning, presented with the evidence, and pressured into a confession, or what the authorities assumed was one. In a small, suffocating interrogation room, the clerk's demeanor shifted from nervous defensiveness to a near-eager compliance. Yes, I was there," he admitted haltingly. "I handled the letters. I don't know, perhaps I left a print, but I didn't—" "Stop," Wimsey said abruptly, stepping forward. His sharp gaze pinned Abernathy in place. "Listen to yourself. You admit to being present, yet you deny committing murder. That is precisely what a man in your position would do if he feared being wrongly accused. Your actions are consistent with someone cautious, conscientious, and, dare I say, innocent of the fatal act itself." Abernathy's relief was palpable. You think I'm not guilty?" he stammered. "I am convinced," Wimsey said firmly, "and I am more convinced that whoever truly committed this crime is still out there, watching and waiting. Your fingerprint is a red herring, a false trail." The police, however, were intoxicated with triumph. News of the supposed breakthrough reached the newspapers within hours. Headlines blared that the mystery of Sir Lionel Chard's death had been solved, and that the murderer was a minor clerk, apparently acting alone. Parker, though wary, allowed the authorities to proceed with the arrest, wary of challenging the immediate official narrative. Wimsey, meanwhile, returned to the apartment, examining the chess pieces again, the white pawn inside, the black knight behind the radiator. "Notice the elegance of the deception, Parker," he said, placing the pieces carefully on the desk. "The killer has created a narrative so compelling that even the police are satisfied, and yet the true architect remains invisible. The game continues, and we are only at mid-board." He reviewed the sequence of events as he understood them. Lady Chard had an alibi that placed her miles away at the time of death. Miss Fairchild's presence across the hall provided observation but no clear access. Abernathy's involvement, though real in terms of his fingerprint, explained nothing about the locked-room murder itself. The mysterious visitor Halstead had glimpsed still hung like a shadow across the story. "Parker, observe how the misdirection functions on multiple levels," Wimsey said. "The clerk's fingerprint offers a convenient solution for the authorities, yet it fails to address the deeper problem. The murderer's method, the calculated staging, the chess symbolism, all point elsewhere. The simplest explanation is rarely the correct one in a case such as this." That evening, Wimsey visited Belhaven once more under the pretense of verifying Abernathy's statements. He moved through the building with a quiet attentiveness, noting the faint traces of activity that others overlooked, the polish of the banister, the slight shift of a doormat, the residual scent of lavender in a corner near Sir Lionel's apartment. He paused near Miss Fairchild's door, listening intently. The faint murmur of conversation through the thin walls suggested she was speaking in hushed tones to someone, though he could not discern the words. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was coordinating, influencing, or observing, keeping the threads of the game carefully managed. Returning to Parker, he said, "The killer is confident, Parker, and not without reason. They have watched the authorities, accept a false resolution, and will use this satisfaction to their advantage. We must not be lulled into complacency." As night fell, Wimsey began piecing together the subtle inconsistencies overlooked in the initial breakthrough. The pawn's placement inside the apartment could indicate the victim's role in the game. A lure or signal, the Black Knight, external yet potent, represented the unseen manipulator. Abernathy's confession, extracted under pressure, had offered only a fragment of truth, the presence of a participant, not the mastermind. Wimsey and Parker returned to the flat with renewed determination. "Every detail we have observed," Wimsey said, "points to deliberate misdirection. The killer trusts our reliance on evidence alone. But observe, Parker, the true criminal is weaving a story beneath the story, a narrative that only patience and insight can reveal." Hours passed as Wimsey examined the crime scene in meticulous detail, retracing movements, re-examining every object, every shadow, every subtle indication of interference. The ink bottle, the letter, the chess pieces, all aligned in a pattern only he seemed to perceive. He noted how the arrangement suggested timing, presence, and control, indicating a mind that not only orchestrated the murder but anticipated the investigation itself. Finally, he looked up at Parker, eyes alight. "The false victory is the most dangerous of all, Parker. When the authorities believe a case is closed, the killer moves freely, confident that we will follow a well-laid diversion. And in such moments, the next move is always the most audacious." Parker exhaled, unease creeping in. "So, the game is far from over." "Indeed," Wimsey said, returning the chess pieces to their careful positions. "Abernathy may have stumbled into a minor role, but the architect, the one who planned every element to ensnare us, remains in the shadows. And I have a feeling, Parker, that when they strike next, the streets of London will silent beneath the moonlit fog, as though the city itself awaited the next move in this deadly game." Inside, Wimsey's mind was already several moves ahead, the pieces of deception laid before him, the true opponent unseen but palpably present. He allowed himself a thin, grim smile. The game was not lost. It had only become more intriguing, and Peter Wimsey intended to see it through to its conclusion, however dangerous the path might become. The next morning, the fog had lifted entirely from London, leaving the streets washed in a brittle, pale light that did little to warm the city. Wimsey sat in his study, a quiet intensity in his gaze, turning over the evidence of the previous days in his mind. The false breakthrough had shifted the police's focus onto Abernathy, but to Wimsey it was clear that the real architect remained carefully hidden. What troubled him most was the sense that he had overlooked something subtle yet crucial, a thread that tied the disparate elements together. He returned to the details of Sir Lionel's last cases, poring over files and trial notes in a methodical review. One, a minor dispute over inheritance involving Lady Chard's distant relatives, seemed innocuous at first glance, yet something about it nagged at him, the subtle bitterness in the correspondence, the meticulous documentation of minor grievances. As he read, a faint memory surfaced, recalling a case from several years prior in which an employee of the Chard estate had vanished under curious circumstances, never mentioned again in official records. "Bunter," Wimsey said, calling the valet over, "do you remember a young clerk named James Abernathy being involved in any minor disputes in the Chard household several years ago? I have a notion that the past is speaking to us through him." Bunter's brow furrowed. "I recall, my lord, a minor incident indeed, a certain financial irregularity involving a small sum from the estate accounts. Nothing came of it officially, but the young man was reprimanded and subsequently reassigned. Wimsey nodded, eyes narrowing. Exactly. The history of the household, the grudges accumulated, and the faint echoes of past slights. They never vanish. They remain, like shadows, shaping the present in ways few perceive. He examined the chess pieces again, the white pawn and the black knight. The symbolism of their placement suggested more than strategy. It hinted at history. The pawn, expendable and easily manipulated, seemed to represent someone being used as a conduit for another's plan. The knight, unpredictable and capable of striking in ways no one anticipates, mirrored the role of the hidden manipulator. Wimsey's intuition whispered that the roots of this deception ran deep, possibly years back, and that Abernathy's fingerprint was part of a pattern laid long ago. Turning his attention to Lady Chard, Wimsey revisited the letters and documents connecting her to the Chard estate. He noticed a series of correspondences previously overlooked, brief notes sent to Sir Lionel concerning the minor inheritance disputes, written in polite, almost perfunctory tones. Yet the timing and recipients hinted at something more clandestine. Lady Chard had been communicating not only with Sir Lionel, but indirectly with Abernathy through coded references to old grievances, financial arrangements, and instructions regarding estate personnel. The letters were ostensibly mundane, yet the subtext suggested influence and planning. "The web begins to tighten," Wimsey murmured, scanning the handwriting and dates. These are not merely coincidental overlaps. Lady Chard's interest in the past, combined with Abernathy's prior grievance, forms a connection no one else has perceived. The chessboard is larger than we imagined, and the moves reach back into history. Parker, who had been reviewing witness statements in the adjoining room, looked up. "You think this murder was orchestrated years in the making, not years in the sense of a prolonged plot," Wimsey said, pacing the room slowly, fingers drumming lightly against the desk. "But the strands of past resentment, minor injustices, and overlooked incidents have created fertile ground for manipulation. Each participant's role, Abernathy's presence, Fairchild's nervous observation, Lady Chard's distant influence, fits a pattern that has been quietly evolving over time." He returned to the case notes, focusing on the visitor Halstead had seen in the hallways a week earlier. The description, a tall figure in a dark coat, suddenly resonated with a memory from the older inheritance dispute. A solicitor had visited the Chard household at odd hours, similarly unannounced, seeking information about the same accounts that had troubled Abernathy. Wimsey realized that the visitor was no new player. He was an echo of a figure connected to the family's unresolved past, now returning under a different guise to execute a long-planned strategy. And here, Wimsey said, eyes narrowing on a particular set of correspondence, is the crucial link. Lady Chard, aware of Abernathy's past grievance, subtly manipulated events so that he would unwittingly become a part of her design. The visitor, the knight outside the apartment, ensured that the proper pressure points were engaged. Sir Lionel, diligent and cautious as he was, recognized this manipulation in time to leave his last warning in the letter. The pawn and knight are not merely symbols, they are markers of historical influence. He called Parker over to the table. "Observe, Parker, the subtlety of it. Lady Chard's motive lies partly in inheritance, partly in control of her own legacy. Abernathy's role is that of the unwitting pawn, manipulated by residual grievances and promises of favor. The visitor orchestrates from the shadows, unseen, ensuring that the game unfolds according to plan. The past has become a weapon, and the present merely its stage." Parker frowned. "So the crime isn't about Abernathy, or even Sir Lionel's present concerns. It's about old tensions resurfacing, orchestrated meticulously." "Precisely," Wimsey said, leaning back in his chair. "And that is why the authorities were so easily satisfied with a false solution. They lacked the patience to perceive that history itself can be a motive, that human connections across time can form a pattern capable of lethal precision." The detective's mind returned to the housekeeper, Mrs. Thorne, whose discreet mentions of a dark-coated visitor now made sense in a broader context. She had been aware, perhaps intuitively, of the historical influences at play, observing silently, recording fragments without fully realizing their significance. Even Miss Fairchild's nervous glances across the hall gained new meaning. She was witnessing the echoes of old conflicts, unaware of their origins, yet entwined in the present consequences. Wimsey's gaze fell once again on the chessboard arrangement, the white pawn and the black knight. The deeper he probed, the clearer it became that the murder was not a sudden act of vengeance, but the culmination of a carefully calculated chain of events rooted in the past. Each actor, each subtle gesture, each misdirection was part of a continuum stretching back years. The killer is confident, Wimsey said quietly, more to Hims. Elf than Parker, because they have understood the enduring influence of past grievances. They have used history as a lens to shape present actions, exploiting what others perceive as coincidences or minor slights. And unless we recognize these patterns, Parker, we will continue to chase shadows. As the day wore on, Wimsey cross-referenced the inheritance documents, the previous employee incidents, and the recent correspondences. Slowly, a map of interconnections emerged, revealing relationships and pressures invisible to the casual observer. Lady Chard's long-term awareness of Abernathy's temperament, the visitor's recurring presence in prior disputes, the subtle observations of household members, all pointed toward a design more elaborate than any had suspected. By evening, Wimsey rose from his chair, eyes bright with determination. The past has spoken, Parker. It has shaped motive, opportunity, and manipulation. What appeared random is deliberate. What appeared disconnected is a continuum. The crime we investigate is as much about history as it is about immediate desire, and in understanding that, we begin to see the true scope of the murderer's strategy. Outside, London's streets shimmered with the faint reflection of gaslight on wet cobblestones, the city seeming to hold its breath in anticipation. Inside, Peter Wimsey allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The shadows of the past were no longer invisible. They were a guide, and if he read them correctly, they would lead directly to the architect of the most intricate murder he had yet encountered. Wimsey awoke the next morning with a quiet determination. The map of motives and past grievances he had traced the previous day weighed heavily on his mind, yet he felt the path forward was now within reach. What was needed was not brute force or conventional interrogation, but a subtle, unconventional tactic to coax the truth from those who believed themselves beyond scrutiny. He shared his plan with Parker as they walked toward Belhaven Apartments, the crisp November air carrying the faint scent of coal smoke from the nearby chimneys. "I intend, Parker, to test the subtle fabric of confidence that our culprit relies upon," Wimsey said, adjusting his scarf against the chill. "People who manipulate carefully often believe that observation alone cannot betray them. But by creating an artificial scenario, a gentle perturbation of their reality, we can prompt a reaction revealing hidden cracks." Parker frowned. "You mean a psychological trick?" "Precisely," Wimsey replied, his eyes glinting. "It is not sufficient to ask questions or observe. We must induce the very behavior the suspect wishes to conceal." Their first step was to invite Lady Chard to the apartment under the pretense of discussing the final estate arrangements. Her composure was immaculate, but Wimsey had noted in the previous days that even the most polished mask could falter under a carefully applied stimulus. "Lady Chard," Wimsey began as she entered, "you must forgive my curiosity, but I have been reflecting upon past events surrounding Sir Lionel's affairs. Certain small overlooked details, financial records, personnel disputes, even minor correspondences, suggest that someone in your household may have acted independently of your knowledge. Perhaps Abernathy, perhaps another intermediary. Your insight would be invaluable." Lady Chard's eyes flickered briefly, the slightest narrowing betraying her surprise at the implication. I cannot imagine anyone acting against my wishes, Mr. Wimsey," she said smoothly, her tone calm, almost rehearsed. Wimsey smiled faintly. "Of course. Yet one cannot ignore the possibility that someone might act out of personal grievance or opportunity exploiting the circumstances we have. Scene. Consider the events surrounding the night of Sir Lionel's death. You understand, surely, the importance of accuracy?" Lady Chard's fingers tightened around her gloves. and she shifted her posture subtly. Whimsey noted the minuscule crack in her composure, the hesitation before she responded. I believe all precautions were taken. Abernathy had no motive beyond what was already known. I cannot imagine. That is precisely the point, Whimsey interrupted gently. We are not suggesting overt hostility, merely influence, subtle persuasion, the sort that could guide an otherwise innocuous person to play a role without realizing its consequences. Her lips pressed together. A faint pallor swept across her cheeks, and for the first time Whimsey detected a rapid intake of breath, almost imperceptible. He allowed the silence to linger, observing the delicate tension in her hands and shoulders. Lady Chard, he continued, lowering his voice, people act differently when confronted with the possibility that their carefully hidden intentions may have been anticipated. Some reveal more than they intend, merely by reacting naturally to hypothetical scenarios. The subtlety of his approach worked almost immediately. Lady Chard's hand trembled slightly as she rested it on the arm of the chair. Her eyes, which had been steady, darted to the chess pieces on the table, the white pawn and the black knight. Whimsey's lips curved into a faint smile. The symbolism had been effective. You placed these pieces deliberately? She asked, her tone almost accusing, almost fearful. I merely use them to illustrate a principle, Whimsey said smoothly. Pawns and knights, roles and positions, movement and strategy. Tell me, Lady Chard, did you ever consider that Sir Lionel might anticipate manipulation, however discreet? Her composure fractured for an instant, replaced by the flash of something sharp, an almost imperceptible admission of awareness. She swallowed hard, and for a heartbeat, Whimsey glimpsed the truth behind her carefully arranged mask. She had not acted openly, but she had orchestrated influence, guided behavior, and understood the subtle leverage of past grievances. Parker, observing quietly from a corner, whispered, I see it. That small shift, that tiny gesture. It's as if she just betrayed herself without knowing it. Yes, Whimsey murmured. The unconventional clue is not an object nor a document. It is a reaction, a flicker of emotion, a slip in the practiced demeanor. These are far more revealing than words alone. Satisfied with this first revelation, Whimsey then directed his attention toward Abernathy, who remained officially under suspicion but outwardly compliant. He invited the young clerk to the apartment under the guise of verifying his statements about the letter deliveries. Abernathy, nervous but relieved at being cleared of immediate accusation, responded with a mixture of eagerness and habitual caution. Mr. Abernathy, Whimsey said, leaning forward with a tone that suggested both authority and camaraderie, we are grateful for your cooperation. I must confess, however, that there are details requiring clarification, small matters of timing, movement, and observation. I would like you to review the sequence of events with me openly and without fear. As Whimsey began recounting the events, Abernathy's reactions became the key to unlocking further truth. The detective interwove hypothetical alternatives, subtle what-ifs designed to provoke instinctive responses. Suppose, Mr. Abernathy, he said, that someone entered the apartment without your knowledge and used your prior presence as cover. Would you have noticed? Abernathy's hand twitched almost imperceptibly. His eyes narrowed, and he swallowed, a bead of sweat forming a T his temple. I suppose it is possible, he said hesitantly. But I cannot imagine anyone doing such a thing. Precisely, Whimsey said softly, noting the flicker of tension. And yet your hesitation, the momentary pause, suggests that you have considered it. Your thoughts have wandered, however briefly, to the possibility of a third party. That is revealing. By the end of the morning, Whimsey had achieved what conventional investigation could not. The subtle, almost invisible cracks in Lady Chard and Abernathy's narratives had emerged. Each reaction, each pause, each fleeting gesture carried information invisible on the surface but undeniable under scrutiny. Even Miss Fairchild, who had been summoned to observe the discussion, displayed faint tension when she noticed Whimsey's strategic placement of the chess pieces, the very symbols that mirrored her own role as observer and inadvertent participant in past manipulations. The unconventional clue, Parker, Whimsey said quietly, leaning against the window frame. is the manifestation of intent in microcosm. It is not what is said, but what cannot be fully concealed. A gesture, a breath, a twitch, these are the fingerprints of truth. Parker, eyes still following Lady Chard's measured movements, nodded slowly. "And the visitor?" he asked, almost hesitantly. "He remains the hidden force," Wimsey replied, voice low, but the reactions of those connected to him, those subtly influenced, knowingly or unknowingly, have illuminated the outline of his presence. The game is far from complete, yet the board is becoming visible. We know now who has been guided, who has acted independently, and who has concealed beyond measure. Our next steps will focus on bringing these invisible threads into the open, testing the architecture of deception itself. Outside, the late autumn sunlight struggled through the London fog, casting the treats in a cold, golden haze. Inside, Peter Wimsey allowed himself a momentary satisfaction. The unconventional clue had done its work, revealing the first true fissures in the mask of carefully constructed deceit. The shadows of hidden intentions were no longer entirely opaque, and he understood that the next move, calculated, deliberate, and inevitable, would draw the criminal into the light. The sense of progress that had infused Wimsey and Parker with a quiet urgency that morning evaporated abruptly that afternoon. A telegram arrived at Wimsey's flat, delivered by an anxious clerk, its official seal intact, yet its message terse and unnerving. The letter Sir Lionel had left on his desk, the one containing the crucial warning and partial cipher, was missing. The police, who had insisted on preserving the scene after Abernathy's fingerprint revelation, now reported that the envelope and its contents had vanished without a trace from the evidence room. Wimsey stared at the note, the corners of his mouth tightening. "So, our game has escalated, Parker. Someone has taken deliberate action to obstruct the truth. The puzzle is no longer solely about motive and opportunity. It is about control." Parker, pale and unsettled, muttered, "They've destroyed the one thing that could have tied everything together. How are we supposed to proceed now?" Wimsey's gaze did not waver. "By remembering that the disappearance itself is a clue. Whoever removed the letter did so with a purpose, leaving behind patterns in their behavior and opportunity. It narrows the field, Parker. We now know that someone in the inner circle, or with access to it, understands the significance of that evidence. And they are not idle. Returning to Belhaven Apartments, Wimsey and Parker began retracing every step of the handling of Sir Lionel's correspondence. The building manager, Halstead, confirmed that the EV, Idence, had been taken to the precinct under the direct supervision of a constable, yet no explanation accounted for its disappearance. Wimsey's eyes lingered on the path between the apartment and the police station, noting the timing of deliveries, the presence of clerks, and the overlapping duties of junior officers. "The simplest opportunity," Wimsey murmured, "is often the one exploited. But the audacity required to remove evidence from an official custody suggests confidence, knowledge, and careful observation. Whoever did this is not acting recklessly. They are calculating, and they have already manipulated several of us." He next visited Lady Chard, ostensibly to inquire whether she had noticed any irregularities concerning the letter or the handling of Sir Lionel's documents. Her composure remained polished, yet Wimsey caught a subtle tension in her hands, a barely perceptible tightening of her jaw when he mentioned the missing correspondence. "You do not suspect me, Mr. Wimsey?" she asked, eyes wide, though there was a flicker of unease in her steady gaze. "Only that you are aware," Wimsey replied carefully, "that certain individuals understand the value of Sir Lionel's last communications and have acted to remove them. Awareness need not indicate guilt, merely knowledge." Lady Chard's breath hitched ever so slightly. Wimsey's observation was precise. The reaction confirmed that she had some insight into who might have orchestrated the removal. It was not a confession, but it was a vital thread. Next he turned to Abernathy, whose earlier relief at being freed from suspicion had been genuine. But the young clerk's composure now showed a new strain. When Wimsey casually mentioned the missing letter, Abernathy's eyes widened imperceptibly, his fingers twisting nervously. I have no idea where it went," he stammered, yet the hesitation spoke louder than the whir. D.S. Wimsey's intuition whispered that Abernathy, though not the mastermind, had been manipulated or exploited as an intermediary. Returning to the apartment, Wimsey examined the chessboard once more. The white pawn and black knight seemed to hold new meaning in light of the vanishing evidence. The missing letter was, in essence, a pawn removed from the board, altering the balance of power, while the black knight, the unseen manipulator, remained free to act without constraint. The pattern of the game had shifted, but the trajectory was still visible to a careful observer. He and Parker spent the afternoon reconstructing the path of the letter in their minds, tracing its handling from Sir Lionel's desk to the evidence room. Wimsey noted the subtle inconsistencies in the logs, the overlapping responsibilities of clerks, and the rare occasions when supervision lapsed. "Observe, Parker," he said, "the vanishing of evidence is never accidental in cases such as this. It is deliberate misdirection, a means to sow doubt, confusion, and mistrust. The perpetrator relies on our frustration, hoping it will slow our deduction." That evening, Wimsey called a discreet meeting with the three individuals he now considered most likely to have indirect involvement: Lady Chard, Abernathy, and Miss Fairchild. He did not accuse, he merely recreated the events of the day, emphasizing the importance of the missing letter and the impossibility of its disappearance without observation or opportunity. "Someone has taken the letter," he said evenly, "and that act tells us far more than the content ever could. It speaks of awareness, calculation, and a desire to conceal the truth. Each of you, in some manner, is linked to the chain of knowledge surrounding this document. I ask you now to consider, what do you know and what must remain hidden?" Lady Chard's eyes flickered, Abernathy's posture stiff. Ned and Miss Fairchild shifted uncomfortably. Wimsey allowed the silence to deepen, sensing the weight of unspoken thoughts. A small slip occurred. Abernathy's hand trembled slightly as he reached for a teacup, a motion almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. In that moment, Wimsey discerned the invisible thread connecting him to the vanishing evidence, not as a thief, but as a witness or unwitting accomplice, manipulated by more experienced hands. Parker leaned closer. "So the disappearance itself is a clue, but also a trap?" "Exactly," Wimsey said, voice low. "It isolates the culpable, signals the invisible, and pressures those who would otherwise remain cautious. The criminal is confident, Parker, because they understand that removing a piece of the puzzle will disorient us. But they have underestimated the observer, who is attuned not only to evidence, but to the behavior surrounding it." Late that night, Wimsey reviewed the sequence of interactions in meticulous detail. He noted that the letter had vanished shortly after the morning round of questioning and before the afternoon log was completed. The timing suggested someone with access, familiarity with the process, and confidence in their manipulation of others' perceptions. Each participant in the household, Lady Chard, Abernathy, Miss Fairchild, had reacted differently, and each reaction revealed a subtle fissure in their otherwise composed facade. "It is a delicate balance, Parker," Wimsey said, surveying the chessboard once more. "The vanishing evidence has heightened the stakes. Trust is fragile, suspicion will rise. But we now see not only the hand that removed the letter, but the network it intersects. The game is accelerating, and the next move, I suspect, will be decisive." Parker exhaled slowly. "Then we must tread carefully. One misstep, and the real culprit could escape entirely." Indeed, Wimsey lied, eyes glinting with resolve. Yet the removal of evidence, while dramatic, cannot conceal the patterns of intent and influence. Each gesture, hesitation, and subtle reaction has revealed the outline of the invisible player, and once we understand the pattern, the shadows will no longer protect them. Outside, the streets were slick with rain, reflecting gaslight like scattered fragments of truth. Inside, Wimsey and Parker prepared to continue their delicate scrutiny, aware that the vanishing evidence had changed the course of the investigation, yet also illuminated the invisible architecture of the crime. The path forward was perilous, the stakes higher than ever, and trust a fragile commodity, but Peter Wimsey was undeterred. The game had shifted, but it was far from lost, and the shadows concealing the true culprit were beginning to unravel. The quiet that had settled over London in the wake of the vanishing letter was shattered abruptly that evening. Wimsey and Parker had just returned from a long day of observation, retracing the movements of household members and reviewing inconsistencies in statements, when a sharp knock echoed through the flat. A breathless messenger handed Wimsey a note, hastily scrawled and soaked from the drizzle outside. The words sent a chill through him. "Sir Lionel's cousin has been found dead in the park. Same manner. Don't trust anyone he knows." Parker stiffened. "Another murder? So soon? I thought Abernathy was supposed to be the culprit. What's happening?" Wimsey's face tightened, his mind already moving at a rapid pace. "The pattern has shifted, Parker. Whoever is orchestrating this is not satisfied with concealment. They are demonstrating control. The disappearance of evidence, the false victory with Abernathy, and now this. It is a warning, a recalibration. The criminal is several steps ahead, and the consequences are immediate. They raced to the scene at Regent's Park, where the body of the cousin, a quiet gentleman named Edward Shard, lay sprawled near a secluded path. The coroner's preliminary assessment indicated strangulation, executed with calculated precision. Wimsey noted the placement of the body and the subtle disturbances in the surroundings, the trampled leaves, a faint scuff of footwear in soft mud, and a discarded handkerchief marked with a monogram. The killer had left just enough to signal their presence, yet not enough to implicate themselves directly. Parker's voice trembled. "It's almost as if they're taunting us, daring us to follow." "Indeed," Wimsey said, crouching beside the body, eyes scanning every detail. "The audacity is deliberate. By committing a second crime, they prove that the network we've been untangling is under their command, and that they are willing to escalate to maintain control." Returning to the precinct to gather witness statements, Wimsey pieced together the events leading up to Edward Shard's murder. He discovered that the cousin had received a mysterious letter the day before, instructing him to meet someone in the park at twilight. The similarity to the missing letter from Sir Lionel's apartment was uncanny, a deliberate manipulation to lure the victim into a vulnerable position. "Observe, Parker," Wimsey said, examining the map of Regent's Park and the placement of the body. "The killer understands timing, human behavior, and the psychology of anticipation. They are not acting randomly, they are enforcing a pattern. Each victim is part of a broader strategy." The investigation took an immediate turn back toward the household. Wimsey returned to Belhaven, now questioning each individual not only about past behavior but about their knowledge of Edward Chard's movements and correspondences. Lady Chard maintained her composure, but the earlier CR acts in her demeanor were more pronounced. She flinched slightly when Wimsey casually mentioned Edward's arrival in London that day. Miss Fairchild, usually quiet and reserved, now appeared anxious, wringing her hands and glancing at the hallway as if expecting someone to appear. Abernathy, meanwhile, had vanished. His room was found empty, belongings neatly packed, as though he had anticipated scrutiny and chosen flight over confrontation. Wimsey noted the irony. The pawn, previously perceived as expendable, had disappeared, leaving the board vulnerable and the Black Knight, the real manipulator, free to act unimpeded. "It seems our fugitive clerk may have been guided by the unseen hand," Wimsey mused. "His flight serves two purposes, to remove a potential witness and to reinforce the narrative of guilt, further distracting the authorities." The afternoon brought an even more startling development. Parker, who had been reviewing logs at the police station, received a panicked call. A message had been left at Wimsey's flat, claiming that an attempt had been made to tamper with the detective's own study. The note was unsigned but chilling. "Next time, we might not be so careful." Wimsey's pulse quickened. Not for himself, but for the fragile web of evidence and human lives under threat. The villain was escalating, signaling not only power but confidence in the precision of their manipulation. Returning to the flat, Wimsey methodically inspected the room. Nothing had been taken, yet subtle signs indicated intrusion: the faint scuff of a shoe on the carpet near the evidence notes, a slightly shifted chess piece on the table. It was a warning, intended to unsettle, but also revealing. Whoever had entered understood the importance of the patterns Wimsey observed, and sought to disrupt them psychologically rather than physically. "Parker," Wimsey said quietly, surveying the shirt. Esport, the criminal has evolved from manipulator to provocateur. Their goal is now to unsettle, to create misdirection and fear. The second murder, the disappearance, the attempted intrusion, they all serve to distract us from the central thread. The orchestration of influence that began with Sir Lionel. They convened once more at Belhaven, focusing on the behavioral evidence gathered from Lady Chard and Miss Fairchild. Wimsey employed subtle psychological pressure, presenting hypothetical scenarios to test their reactions. Lady Chard's response was measured but tense. She blinked rapidly and avoided direct eye contact when confronted with the notion of someone exploiting past grievances to orchestrate new crimes. Miss Fairchild, under similar questioning, displayed visible tremors of anxiety, glancing at the door repeatedly as if anticipating an unseen presence. "Observe, Parker," Wimsey said. "The psychological interplay is as crucial as physical evidence. The criminal is forcing movement, reaction, and misstep. Each response narrows the field, revealing the degree to which each individual is aware, complicit, or manipulated." Night fell over London as Wimsey and Parker reviewed the sequence of events in silence. The second murder had dramatically altered the investigation. Abernathy's disappearance, Edward Chard's death, and the intrusion at the flat were not random. They were deliberate moves in a pattern that the detective recognized, yet one still shrouded in uncertainty. The villain was several steps ahead, their strategy both protective and aggressive, designed to test the limits of observation and deduction. Wimsey finally rose, walking to the window, staring at the fog-tinged streets below. "The unexpected twist," he said, voice low, "is a reminder that our work is not linear. The disappearance, the murder, the intrusion, they are all connected by a single mind, careful, calculating, and confident. We must anticipate their next move, Parker, not merely react. And in doing so, we might prevent another tragedy before it occurs." Parker exhaled, a mixture of dread and determination in his expression. "Then we move forward with caution but with purpose. The villain is playing chess, and we cannot afford to be pawns." Wimsey's eyes gleamed with resolve. "No, Parker. We will no longer merely observe. We will set the board in such a way that the Black Knight, the unseen manipulator, is forced to reveal themselves. The next move belongs to us, and when it comes, the pattern will no longer conceal the truth. But until then, every shadow, every hesitation, every subtle reaction is vital. The game continues, and the stakes have never been higher." Outside, the fog rolled across the gaslit streets, curling around lamp-posts and shop-fronts, as though concealing the sinister presence that still lurked. Inside, Peter Wimsey allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, knowing the unexpected twist was not an end, but a pivot, a signal that the true confrontation was approaching, and that only careful, precise observation could prevent the next calamity. Wimsey spent the following morning in near silence, moving deliberately through the evidence he had collected over the past week. Each crime, each subtle reaction, each missing or manipulated piece of evidence seemed disparate at first, but he was confident that the threads would converge. He traced movements, re-examined correspondences, and replayed the behavioral clues, the flickers of unease, the tiny gestures, the reactions to hypothetical scenarios. Something, he felt, had been hiding in plain sight, overlooked because it appeared trivial, even innocuous. Parker watched him quietly, notebook in hand, ready to record insights but aware that Wimsey's mind worked in a rhythm of its own. "You seem certain that there's a pattern, Peter," he said. "Though I confess I still see chaos, disappearances, murders, intrusions. It all seems too messy to connect." "That, Parker," Wimsey replied, fingers tracing the rim of his teacup, "is precisely why we must focus on the minutiae. In cases orchestrated by a careful hand, the grand design is often hidden behind deliberate chaos. The key, I suspect, is a detail so small it has evaded notice." He returned to Regent's Park in the early afternoon, retracing Edward Chard's final movements with painstaking care. The body had been discovered near a small, nearly hidden grove, a location unusual for a casual evening walk. Wimsey crouched low, examining the leaves, mud, and faint footprints. Most were obvious misdirections, left by park-goers and passers-by, but one trace, a small irregular indentation in soft earth, overlooked by both police and coroner, caught his attention. It was a peculiar scuff mark, almost resembling a dragged object rather than a footprint, and he recognized it immediately. The motion matched the subtle shift of the chessboard's black knight during the earlier observations. "See here, Parker," Wimsey said, pointing. "The motion of the object corresponds not only to physical displacement, but to deliberate psychological signaling. The criminal moves pieces in the real world, mirroring the figurative strategy we observed on the chessboard. It is as though Sir Lionel's final warning has been enacted step by someone who understands the interplay of presence, absence, and expectation." The detective returned to Belhaven with renewed determination. He reviewed every minor action, every overlooked gesture, every correspondence. And then, a comment that Miss Fairchild had made in passing, seemingly inconsequential, drew his attention. She had mentioned that Abernathy had an unusual habit of alwa, tapping a rhythm with his fingers when nervous. At the time, it had appeared irrelevant, a mere quirk, but now, in the context of the vanishing evidence and the behavioral reactions, it clicked. "The rhythm, Parker," Wimsey said, a spark of clarity in his eyes, "is a code of anxiety. Abernathy's unconscious signaling aligns with moments when he was aware of manipulations or inconsistencies, moments when he observed more than he revealed. That tiny gesture has been our window into his awareness all along. The key has indeed been in plain sight. We simply lacked the perspective to interpret it." With this insight, Wimsey began mapping interactions anew. Lady Chard's subtle flinches, Abernathy's finger-tapping, Miss Fairchild's repeated glances at the hallway, they all aligned temporally with the removal of evidence, the second murder, and the attempted intrusion at the flat. The invisible hand orchestrating the events had relied on these small instinctive signals to guide the secondary actors, ensuring their actions served the broader plan. He recreated the sequence in his mind: Sir Lionel's last letter, the Black Knight outside the apartment, Abernathy's manipulation under coercion or promise, Lady Chard's psychological influence, and Miss Fairchild's unintended role as observer. Each seemingly random or trivial behavior now revealed itself as a cog in a meticulously designed machine. Parker's brow furrowed. So all of this, the second murder, the disappearance, the intrusions, it was designed to manipulate these smaller players, to make them act in ways that would shield the true culprit. "Exactly," Wimsey said, moving the chess pieces on the table, letting his fingers trace the movements as though recreating a battle. "The pattern is that of influence, anticipation, and reaction. The criminal has not simply committed acts. They have choreographed human behavior in Surrey. That each minor actor unwittingly perpetuates the design. And the rhythm, the tapping, the flinches, the glances, is the signal, the hidden language that allowed them to coordinate without detection." This realization led Wimsey to the final, most delicate element, timing. By aligning the subtle reactions with the known chronology of letters, visits, and disappearances, he discerned that the criminal had been operating not just with foresight, but with intimate knowledge of each participant's habits, fears, and routines. It was not mere chance that Abernathy's fingerprint was the false victory, nor that Edward Chard had been lured to the park at precisely that hour. Each event was a calculated move in a long game, the true scope of which was finally visible. Wimsey stood, pacing the room as the pieces clicked into place in his mind. The Black Knight, always moving unpredictably, represented the unseen orchestrator, the mastermind who had understood the vulnerabilities and predictable behaviors of every other player. The white pawn, used and manipulated, had been both shield and signal. The letters, the murders, the intrusions, all were coordinated along this invisible chessboard. "Parker," Wimsey said, voice calm but edged with urgency. "The pattern emerges, and with it, the identity of the player controlling it. The clues were always present, in the gestures, the habits, the inconsistencies we overlooked in our focus on evidence alone. The vanishing letter, the second murder, the small movements of the human pieces, they were never random. They were signals, markers of orchestration." Parker's eyes widened with the magnitude of the realization. So all of the seemingly minor behaviors, the tapping, the flinches, the pauses, were deliberate indicators that the key to the mystery was hidden in the smallest gestures? Yes, Wimsey said, moving to the window and staring own the fog-laden streets of London. And now that we see the pattern, the entire sequence of events can be anticipated. The master of this game believes themselves secure, having relied on human habits, misdirection, and careful concealment. But the language they have used, subtle, instinctive, almost invisible, has revealed them. The final moves are now within reach, and nothing, Parker, will remain hidden for long. He returned to the chessboard on the table, rearranging the pieces to mirror the emerging pattern, the Black Knight poised at the edge of the board, Abernathy's pawn in motion, Lady Chard and Miss Fairchild positioned by gestures and timing, all aligning into a coherent design. For the first time, the chaos of the past week crystallized into clarity. The invisible thread, Wimsey murmured, has become visible. The pattern has emerged. And when it does, Parker, the shadows will no longer shield the culprit, and the game, finally, will end in revelation. Outside, London's fog hung low over the streets, reflecting the soft glow of lamplight. Inside, Peter Wimsey allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph, for the smallest, most overlooked details, gestures, habits, subtle reactions, had illuminated the hidden architecture of the crime. The master manipulator could no longer act unseen. The next step would require precision, daring, and timing. But now, at last, the detective held the pattern in his mind, and the board was ready for the final moves. Wimsey spent the early hours of the next morning in contemplative silence, arranging the chess pieces on his table in the precise positions that mirrored the behavioral patterns he had observed over the past week. Every gesture, every small reaction, every subtle hesitation now formed part of a coherent narrative that pointed unerringly toward the orchestrator. Yet even with the emerging pattern, Wimsey understood the surface motives, inheritance, resentment, opportunity, were merely smokescreens. What had driven the criminal to such extremes lay deeper, hidden beneath the obvious, waiting to be uncovered. He began by revisiting Lady Chard's correspondence, reviewing letters and financial records with Parker at his side. The documents revealed the customary concerns over property, minor inheritances, and household management. On their face, they were innocuous. Yet Wimsey's scrutiny uncovered a series of repeated, almost obsessive references to family reputation, societal perception, and control over narrative. It became apparent that Lady Chard's interests extended beyond material gain. They were entwined with a need for influence, for dominance over both perception and circumstance. "Observe, Parker," Wimsey said, gesturing to a letter from months prior. "These are not ordinary concerns. Note the careful phrasing, the recurring insistence on propriety, the subtle direction of household actions. This is a person for whom control is paramount, not merely of money, but of events, perceptions, and ultimately people themselves." Parker leaned over, brow furrowed. "You mean this isn't just about inheritance? It's about power in a psychological sense?" "Precisely," Wimsey replied. "The criminal has manipulated every pawn, orchestrated every knight's move, not simply for gain, but to prove something about their own superiority, about their ability to shape the world according to their design. The murders, the disappearances, the thefts of evidence. Each was a calculated assertion of dominance, a test of human behavior under pressure." The detective then considered Abernathy, whose nervous tapping and flight had been pivotal. Wimsey realized the young clerk had been used as a test subject, a tool to explore the reactions of those around him and to measure the success of psychological manipulation. The disappearance of the letter, which had seemed a minor disruption, was in fact part of this intricate game. By inducing tension and uncertainty, the orchestrator was probing boundaries, observing responses, and shaping outcomes in real time. Turning back to Lady Chard, Wimsey reviewed her reactions to his previous questioning, the flinches, the subtle avoidance of eye contact, the micro-tremors of acknowledgement. Each behavior aligned with the emerging psychological profile, a person who craved control, who relished the orchestration of events to test human responses, and who regarded manipulation not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. And here, Wimsey murmured, examining a marginal note in one of her letters, is the final clue. She refers to a lesson that must be taught regarding loyalty and perception. Not money, not property, but obedience, understanding, and the demonstration of influence. That is the motive, Parker. The compulsion to demonstrate control, to manipulate outcomes to prove, even to herself, that she can direct the course of events undetected. Everything else, inheritance, minor slights, past grievances, has been camouflage. Parker exhaled sharply. You mean she killed not for revenge or gain, but to prove she could? To manipulate everyone like chess pieces? Exactly, Wimsey said, voice calm but resolute. The sophistication of the crime lies in the depth of the psychology. The removal of evidence, the second murder, the intrusions, all were exercises in testing human behavior, in confirming the orchestrator's perception of control. Each actor, from Abernathy to Miss Fairchild, was a participant in a carefully designed psychological experiment. And the true horror lies in the deliberate precision with which it was executed. The murders themselves were secondary. The primary objective was dominance and the satisfaction of a meticulous mind. He paused, considering the timeline. The disappearance of the letter, Edward Chard's murder, Abernathy's flight, all these events now fit a sequence that revealed a consistent pattern of behavioral manipulation. Lady Chard's obsession with propriety and the orchestration of events had dictated each move, turning even seemingly minor actors into extensions of her will. There is one final element, Wimsey continued. Notice the careful timing of actions, the precise alignment with individual vulnerabilities, and the reliance on predictably human reactions. This is not a crime of impulse, it is a deliberate orchestration of human psychology. The vanishing evidence was not intended to hinder investigation in itself. It was a test of response, a measure of perception and adaptability. The killings were similarly staged to gauge reactions, to observe, to reinforce authority. The motive is revealed not in what was taken, but in how it was orchestrated. Parker's hands shook slightly. So we've been following clues that weren't just about the crime, but about her mind. And now we see what drove her need to dominate, to control, even manipulate us. Yes, Wimsey replied, and that is why the pattern was so difficult to discern. The criminal's objective was psychological rather than material. The crimes were a demonstration of capability, an assertion of intellect over circumstance. In understanding this, Parker, we can anticipate the next move, predict the manipulations, and ultimately constrain the orchestrator before more harm is done. He returned to the chessboard, arranging the pieces to mirror the psychological profile he had reconstructed. The Black Knight remained at the edge, representative of Lady Chard's unseen control. The White Pawn, previously Abernathy, now stood in the space of manipulated action. Other pieces mirrored the indirect influences on household members. The tableau was no longer a mere puzzle of events. It was a map of psychological dominance, revealing the orchestrator's methods, aims, and ultimate satisfaction. Observe, Parker, Wimsey said, voice firm, the pattern of influence, timing, and subtle human signals has revealed the motive. It is far more insidious than revenge, greed, or fear. The criminal's psychology has dictated every move. Understanding this is the key to confronting her, anticipating her next step, and preventing further tragedy. And now that we see the motive, we understand the lengths to which she is willing to go. Outside, the autumn wind swept through the streets of London, carrying a chill that mirrored the unease within Belhaven. Inside, Peter Wimsey allowed himself the satisfaction of clarity. The crimes had been executed with meticulous planning, but the human elements, the small gestures, the flinches, the subtle behavioral cues, had betrayed the orchestrator's inner purpose. The hidden motive was now exposed. It was a craving for psychological dominance, a test of human response, and the satisfaction of executing a plan with total control over perception and consequence. Wimsey turned to Parker, eyes steady. We now know what drives her, and with this understanding, Parker, we can begin to constrain her actions, predict her manipulations, and ultimately bring the game to its conclusion. The motive has been revealed, and with it, the path forward becomes clear. All that remains is to execute the next steps with precision. Parker nodded slowly, the weight of realization settling over him. So everything, the vanishing evidence, the murders, the manipulations, was part of her design. It's terrifying to think how far she was willing to go just to prove herself. Terrifying indeed, Wimsey said, moving back to the chessboard, his fingers brushing lightly over the black knight, but no longer hidden. The pattern has emerged, the motive is clear, and the shadow that has guided every action will soon be revealed. The game nears its climax, and every move we make now must be precise, deliberate, and unwavering. The final confrontation is approaching, Parker, and we are ready. Wimsey spent the morning in meticulous preparation, reviewing the pattern he had reconstructed and arranging the sequence that would bring the orchestrator into the open. Every detail mattered, the placement of furniture, the timing of arrivals, even the seemingly insignificant habits of those involved. The chessboard on his table had become more than a metaphor. It was a map of human behavior, and he intended to execute the final moves with surgical precision. He called Lady Chard under the pretense of discussing unresolved matters concerning the estate. Parker was stationed discreetly nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. Wimsey greeted her with cordiality, concealing the intensity of his purpose beneath a mask of civility. "Lady Chard," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "I appreciate your patience. There remain a few details regarding Sir Lionel's final days and Edward Chard's movements that require clarification. I believe it is in everyone's interest to resolve these matters fully." She smiled faintly, her composure intact, though Wimsey noticed a subtle tension in her hands and a faint flicker in her eyes as they met his. The pause, almost imperceptible, was exactly the signal he had anticipated. "I trust you are speaking merely of facts, Mr. Wimsey," she said, her tone smooth but with an edge of caution. "Of course," he replied softly, letting the words hang. "Facts are all that concern us, yet facts can sometimes reveal patterns invisible at first glance. One may overlook a gesture, a remark, or an absence that, when combined with others, becomes undeniable." Lady Chard's eyes narrowed slightly. Wimsey allowed the pause to linger, observing the micro-shifts in her posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. "Patterns, you say?" she asked, voice measured, yet her fingers gripped the arm of the chair ever so subtly. "Yes," Wimsey said, leaning forward slightly, his gaze calm but unyielding. "A pattern that links Sir Lionel's warnings, the missing letter, Abernathy's behavior, Edward Chard's tragic end, and even minor reactions in your household. Each seemingly trivial element has contributed to a coherent design, one that cannot be ignored." Her hand twitched, betraying a flicker of anxiety. Wimsey noted it, committing the detail to memory. "You speak as if you understand the entire sequence," she said. "And yet, Mr. Wimsey, are you suggesting that someone has manipulated these events?" "I am suggesting, Lady Chard, that someone has orchestrated them," Wimsey replied gently, "and that the orchestration has been guided by a desire for control, a need to see the world conform to their will, to test human reactions, to ensure that no one acts without their design being acknowledged. The pattern is complete, and the player is no longer hidden." Her expression remained composed, yet a subtle pallor spread across her cheeks. Wimsey leaned back slightly, allowing the room to fall into a tense silence, his calm confidence pressing upon her. "You are speaking of yourself," she said finally, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of fear. "You believe I am responsible for all of this?" "Responsibility, Lady Chard, is not merely the act itself," Wimsey said softly, "but the orchestration of events leading to outcomes. You guided Abernathy, influenced Miss Fairchild, determined the timing, and, through careful observation, ensured that the consequences aligned with your design. The motive, as we have discerned, is not inheritance or revenge, it is dominance, the assertion of intellect and control over human behavior. You could not resist the demonstration of your influence. A shadow passed across her face, and Wimsey saw the first fissure in her carefully constructed facade. Her eyes darted toward the chessboard, now deliberately arranged in the exact positions corresponding to past events. The symbolism was undeniable. She recognized the representation of her manipulation, and the weight of exposure began to press upon her. I did not mean for anyone to die," she said softly, her composure faltering. I wanted to test them, to see if they would act as expected." "Test?" Wimsey's voice was gentle, almost incredulous. "You tested human lives as if they were pieces on a board. Edward Chard was killed, Abernathy forced to flee, the missing letter removed, all part of your experiment. Do you comprehend the severity of your actions?" Her hands trembled as she gripped the armrests. "I did not anticipate the deaths. I did not intend. You intended manipulation, and manipulation led to tragedy," Wimsey said firmly. "The psychology of your actions is clear, and now that the pattern is understood, your control over these events is over. The game is no longer yours to command." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. Lady Chard's shoulders slumped, her carefully maintained poise giving way to the realization that her orchestration had been uncovered. She glanced toward the window, perhaps considering flight, but the calm certainty in Wimsey's gaze, and the presence of Parker discreetly positioned, left no room for escape, I suppose. "There is no way to salvage this," she said quietly, finally surrendering to the truth she had long hidden. "I only wanted to prove. My understanding, my skill. The others, they were part of the test." Wimsey inclined his head, the composure of his demeanor never wavering. "The test has concluded, Lady Chard. The pattern, the motive, the manipulations, all are revealed. There is no longer any ambiguity. Your actions will now be subject to consequence, and the lives affected will, at last, be acknowledged." Tears glimmered in her eyes, but there was no defiance, only the stark acknowledgment of exposure. She understood fully that the intricate web she had woven for her own assertion of psychological dominance had unraveled, and the orchestrator's identity was laid bare. Parker, observing silently, "Final." He spoke. "It's over, then? We've understood the pattern, discovered the motive, and she has confessed." Wimsey nodded. "Yes, Parker, the final confrontation is never merely about accusation. It is about revealing the structure beneath the chaos, understanding the psychology driving action, and ensuring that exposure is complete. The board is cleared, the pieces accounted for, and the orchestrator stands revealed before us, unable to continue the deception." Lady Chard's hands fell to her lap, her composure fractured, yet a faint clarity shone in her eyes. She had been unmasked, confronted not with anger, but with the precision of observation and understanding that had guided every step of the investigation. The tension in the room, once palpable and suffocating, eased slightly, replaced by the quiet inevitability of justice now set in motion. "The complexity of your design, Lady Chard," Wimsey said, voice soft but steady, "was remarkable. Yet even the most intricate pattern cannot withstand the scrutiny of careful observation. Every gesture, every hesitation, every subtle clue has led us here, and now, at last, the truth stands revealed, immutable and undeniable." Outside, the fog of London seemed less oppressive, as though the exposure of hidden manipulations had lifted a weight from the streets. Inside, Peter Wimsey allowed himself a moment of reflection. The pattern had emerged, the hidden motive uncovered, and the orchestrator confronted. The final confrontation had not required force nor fury. It required understanding, patience, and the quiet power of seeing what others overlooked. Lady Chard remained seated, her pride shattered but her identity fully revealed, as Wimsey straightened and motioned for Parker to follow him. The case, at last, had reached its resolution. The intricate web of deception, manipulation, and psychological control had been untangled. Human chessboard laid bare, and the orchestrator of tragedy unmasked in full view. The game was over, and truth had prevailed. The day after Lady Chard's confession, London seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The fog hung low but harmless over the streets, and Peter Wimsey allowed himself a moment to enjoy the fragile calm. Parker was busy coordinating statements and ensuring that Abernathy, now returned under careful supervision, was safely taken into custody and questioned further. The chessboard of human behavior seemed, at last, settled, yet Wimsey's instincts, honed by countless investigations, would not permit complacency. Even as the authorities moved to close the case, a single nagging inconsistency remained at the edge of his mind. The final confrontation had revealed Lady Chard's orchestration, her psychological dominance, her manipulations, but something about the timing, the precision of certain moves, and Abernathy's behavior still felt incomplete. A detail that should have aligned perfectly with the pattern did not. That afternoon, Wimsey revisited Regent's Park, retracing Edward Chard's last steps and examining the small grove where the body had been found. He observed the same subtle scuffs and trampled leaves, and then, almost instinctively, he noticed a tiny thread caught on a bramble, a thread that was impossibly fine but unmistakably synthetic. It had not been there before, and it did not belong to any item Lady Chard possessed. Parker looked over his shoulder, puzzled. A thread? How could that change anything? We already know Lady Chard orchestrated the events. Wimsey knelt, inspecting the strand closely. It is small, yes, but its significance lies not in the object itself, but in its source. Whoever left this thread had access to Edward Chard's clothing and to the scene after the supposed orchestration was already in motion. It suggests separate from Lady Chard's, acting independently or in concert but undetected. Returning to the flat, Wimsey studied Abernathy again. The young clerk had provided testimony about Lady Chard's manipulations, yet when pressed about movements immediately prior to Edward Chard's death, he hesitated longer than previously noted. Wimsey leaned closer. "You observed something, Abernathy. Something you did not tell us before. What is it?" Abernathy swallowed hard, avoiding Wimsey's gaze. I thought it was nothing at the time. But there was someone else. I didn't see their face, only a shadow. But they were near the grove before Edward was found. I thought it was just someone passing by." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. A shadow. So while Lady Chard orchestrated the broader scheme, another participant, unknown to us, was present at the critical moment, and this shadow acted independently, leaving evidence that Lady Chard could not have accounted for. Parker frowned. "Are you suggesting Lady Chard wasn't the whole story? That someone else, another mastermind, was controlling events behind the scenes?" "Not controlling," Wimsey clarified, "influencing, exploiting, and opportunistically intervening. Lady Chard's pattern of manipulation was extensive, but it seems she was not entirely alone in the execution. The thread, the shadow, Abernathy's delayed recognition, all point to a final player who has remained invisible until now." Wimsey revisited the list of household members, servants and associates. He considered their routines, their access, and their knowledge of the Chard family dynamics. A minor figure, previously dismissed as irrelevant, came sharply into focus. Mr. Halstead, the building manager, whose movements had always seemed peripheral. Wimsey recalled small details, Halstead's occasional unexplained absences, his attentive observation of Lady Chard and Abernathy and Sue, BTLE changes in his demeanour when Edward Chard was mentioned. He was always watching, Wimsey murmured to Parker, quiet, unassuming, and seemingly compliant. But a careful observer of human behaviour can be an invisible manipulator. Halstead had the opportunity, the knowledge, and the patience to act in the shadows. Lady Chard's orchestration provided cover, and he exploited it. The final twist, Parker, is that she was the visible player while he remained hidden, the true opportunist who stepped in at the critical moment. They returned to Halstead's quarters under the guise of routine questioning. Wimsey's approach was deliberate, calm, and unrelenting. He asked seemingly innocuous questions about daily routines, visitor logs, and maintenance duties, carefully observing Halstead's posture, gestures, and fleeting expressions. When Wimsey casually mentioned Regent's Park and Edward Chard's last known movements, Halstead stiffened imperceptibly, his hands curling tightly around the edge of the desk. I don't know what you mean, he said, voice clipped. Of course, Whimsey said gently. You observed something, did you not? A moment, perhaps, that seemed trivial at the time, but in hindsight carries enormous significance. You saw an opportunity to intervene while Lady Chard's manipulations were in motion. Halstead's face paled, the first cracks of composure appearing. He tried to deflect, mentioning deliveries and maintenance schedules, but Whimsey, steady and patient, allowed the silence to build until the pressure of observation forced confession. I didn't intend to, Halstead began, voice shaking. I thought, when Lady Chard had planned it all, I acted when Edward. He shouldn't have seen certain things. I didn't want more chaos, but it happened. I only wanted to protect her interests, and I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Whimsey's gaze remained calm, unyielding. You acted opportunistically, Halstead. You seized a moment within Lady Chard's orchestration. Your interference resulted in consequences she did not foresee. The final murder, the vanishing evidence, the subtle signals Abernathy noted. You are, in essence, a secondary manipulator, hidden in plain sight. And yet, your presence explains the final anomalies, the thread, the shadow, the subtle discrepancy in Abernathy's testimony. Parker exhaled, astonished. So all this time we thought Lady Chard was the entire mastermind, and yet she was essentially a pawn in Halstead's opportunism, or at least she was unaware of his final intervention. Not a pawn, Whimsey clarified. She was the visible hand, manipulating broadly. But Halstead was the silent observer, the opportunist who intervened at a critical moment. The final twist is that the orchestrator's design was subtly altered by an independent actor, revealing that even the most carefully constructed pattern can be disrupted by another mind equally attentive, equally patient, but unnoticed. Faced with this revelation, the case was no longer straightforward. Lady Chard remained culpable for her manipulations, but Halstead's unseen intervention explained the discrepancies in timing, the final anomalies, and Abernathy's hesitations. Whimsey understood that this last-minute twist did not diminish the psychological orchestration he had uncovered, but rather deepened it. Two minds, one visible and one hidden, had intersected in a deadly dance, leaving the final moves for careful deduction to reveal. By evening, both Lady Chard and Halstead were in custody, their confessions intertwined yet distinct. Whimsey, surveying the outcome, reflected that the genius of the investigation had been tested to its limits. The apparent resolution had been illusory, only by tracing patterns, observing human behavior, and remaining vigilant to the smallest discrepancies, had the final truth emerged. Even in the most controlled design, Whimsey said to Parker, surveying the chessboard as the evening light faded, there is always room for disruption, and in disruption the final pattern reveals itself. Our work, Parker, is never simply about solving crimes. It is about understanding the invisible architecture that drives them, and when the last-minute twist appears, it is the careful observer who prevails. Outside, London's fog thickened as gas lamps flickered along deserted streets. Inside, Whimsey allowed himself the faintest smile. The mastermind was unmasked, the secondary manipulator revealed, and the complex web of control and opportunism had been fully exposed. The game was complete, and every piece accounted for, yet the lesson remained. Even in apparent closure, the shadows could harbor secrets waiting for the keenest mind to illuminate them. The morning air in London carried a chill as Peter Whimsey walked through the quiet streets, reflecting on the extraordinary sequence of events that had unfolded over the past weeks. The city, wrapped in mist and shadow, seemed to echo the residual tension of the case, a labyrinth of manipulations, vanishing evidence, hidden motives, and finally, the last-minute twist that had exposed Halstead's opportunism. The arrests of Lady Chard and Halstead were complete, yet the city's stillness felt uneasy, as though the aftermath of human ambition and cunning lingered in the fog. Back at Belhaven, Whimsey gathered Parker and a few senior officers to review the sequence of events, ensuring that every detail was catalogued, every clue accounted for. Lady Chard's confession had illuminated her psychological motive, dominance, and the compulsion to manipulate events and people to satisfy her intellect. Halstead's admission explained the final anomalies, the vanishing letter, the subtle discrepancies in Abernathy's testimony, the small scuff marks near the grove. Yet even with both confessions in hand, Wimsey could not ignore the subtler threads of behavior and timing that had initially hinted at the true complexity of the case. "Observe, Parker," Wimsey said, arranging the chess pieces on the table once more. Each player, each move, represented both a choice and a constraint. Lady Chard orchestrated broadly, exerting her psychological dominance over the household and her immediate associates. Halstead intervened as a hidden hand, exploiting the openings she created. The tragedy of Edward Chard, the flight of Abernathy, the secondary manipulations, they were all part of a web that relied on human predictability, yet the unpredictable emerged at the end. Parker nodded, following the arrangement with his eyes. "It's remarkable, almost terrifying, how much control they exercised, yet even so justice seems complicated. Do you truly think both of them will pay for this?" Wimsey's gaze was steady, his mind tracing the connections. "Justice, Parker, is rarely as simple as punishment alone. It is the illumination of truth, the correction of misperception, and the acknowledgement of culpability. Lady Chard and Halstead have been exposed, their actions documented, their manipulations laid bare. The authorities can now act decisively. Yet consider this, even when the law is served, the consequences of human manipulation extend beyond incarceration. Abernathy bears the mark of psychological coercion. The surviving household members will carry the shadow of manipulation for some time. Justice, in this case, is measured as much in understanding as in retribution." As Wimsey spoke, a letter was delivered by the constable, postmarked from a small village outside London. Parker tore it open curiously, only to reveal a brief note writ. In precise, formal script, "Mr. Wimsey, you have unravelled the patterns you observed and exposed Lady Chard and Halstead for their manipulations. Yet be aware, even the smallest disruption can alter a plan beyond recognition. Consider carefully the final pieces, for the game is never truly complete. A friend." Wimsey read the note calmly, his eyes flicking over the elegant handwriting. He recognized the subtle warning, the faint taunt hidden in its civility. A smile, almost imperceptible, touched his lips. The note confirmed his instinct. The masterminds had been revealed, yet in human affairs, true control is never absolute. Even the best-laid plans are subject to unpredictability, to chance, and to the human tendency to deviate from expectation. "Observe, Parker," Wimsey said, placing the note beside the chessboard. "Even after apparent resolution there is always the potential for deviation. The visible manipulators, Lady Chard and Halstead, have been restrained, yet their orchestration has already left consequences that no law can fully undo. Abernathy's hesitations, the second murder, the vanishing evidence, these were the echoes of their influence. And now, this note reminds us that the game extends beyond the visible players." Parker frowned, uneasy. "Are you saying someone else might have been involved or might still interfere?" "Not necessarily intervention, Parker," Wimsey replied, his tone calm and analytical, "but influence. The residual effects of the manipulations, the human behaviors, the subtle triggers planted in others' minds, persist. Justice is served in terms of exposure and accountability, yet the consequences ripple outward. The small cues we missed, the gestures, the flinches, the habits, they have already shaped perception and action beyond our immediate control. The final lesson is that awareness and vigilance are the truest instruments of justice." He moved the Black Knight on the chessboard, tracing a deliberate path that mirrored Halstead's hidden intervention. "Consider this," he continued, "the misplaced thread in the grove, the shadow Abernathy noticed, the timing of Lady Chard's manipulations. They were all minor elements, easily dismissed. Yet those minor elements carried enormous significance. Those who believe that control is absolute failed to account for the smallest variable, a subtle signal, a hidden observer, a chance interference. The game ends, but the consequences endure." Outside, the fog thickened as dusk fell, shrouding the streets in uncertainty. London's gas lamps flickered weakly through the haze, casting long, shifting shadows along the pavement. Inside Belhaven, Wimsey allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The orchestrators had been unmasked, their motives exposed, and the web of manipulation revealed, yet he knew that the resolution was never truly final. Parker, watching his mentor, remarked softly, "It's unsettling, isn't it, that even with everything revealed, there's a sense that the case isn't completely closed?" Wimsey smiled faintly, a glimmer of wry amusement in his eyes. "Precisely, Parker. Cases are rarely simple, and human behavior resists full containment. Justice has been administered in terms of accountability, yet the subtle traces of manipulation, the lessons learned, and the psychological echoes remain. We may observe, record, and constrain, but we cannot eliminate the unpredictability inherent in human nature. That is the final truth of any investigation. The smallest signals, the gestures, the flinches, the overlooked cues, carry weight long after the overt acts are addressed." He leaned back, fingers lightly brushing the chess pieces. The board, once a map of manipulation and tragedy, now represented resolution tempered with lingering complexity. Lady R&D and Halstead were in custody, their confessions documented, the evidence meticulously catalogued, yet the faint reminder in the delivered note signified that vigilance must endure. The game, in some sense, was never fully complete, but for now, justice had been served to the extent human law and observation could achieve. Parker exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing, yet he remained thoughtful. And the people who were manipulated, Abernathy, Miss Fairchild, the household, they'll carry the effects with them, won't they? Yes, Wimsey said softly, and so it should be remembered, the truth, once revealed, does not erase the consequences of manipulation, but by uncovering patterns, observing subtle cues, and remaining vigilant, we illuminate what was once hidden. Justice has been delivered, Parker, yet the shadows of human behavior ensure that we remain ever alert, for the game is never entirely over, and the smallest overlooked detail may yet influence the next move. The fog deepened outside, curling around the lamplights and along the quiet streets, and within Belhaven, Peter Wimsey and Parker surveyed the room, the chessboard, and the carefully arranged evidence. Justice had been served, yet the lingering uncertainty of human complexity remained, a reminder that the resolution of one intricate game only prepared them for the next. And in that truth, Wimsey's keen mind found both satisfaction and the perpetual challenge of the detective's art. The following morning dawned cold and crisp, the streets of London shrouded in the faint haze that seemed to linger long after the fog had lifted. Peter Wimsey walked slowly through the quiet city, Parker trailing close behind, both lost in thought. The case of Lady Chard and Halstead, with its intricate layers of manipulation, vanishing evidence, and hidden motives, was officially closed, or so it seemed. Yet Wimsey's mind, attuned to the subtle disturbances beneath the surface, remained restless. They passed through the familiar streets near Belhaven, Wimsey noting the small details others might dismiss, a door left slightly ajar, the faint scratch of a paw on a gate-post, the way a window's reflection fractured the light in unexpected patterns. Each fragment of observation was catalogued in his mind. Though Lady Chard and Halstead were in custody, the smallest anomalies hinted that the human chessboard was never entirely empty, that other players might still linger in the shadows. Returning to the flat, Wimsey examined the chessboard one final time. The Black Knight, representing Halstead, and the Queen, representing Lady Chard, had been removed, leaving only the pawns of Abernathy, Miss Fairchild, and other minor actors. Yet even with the primary manipulators gone, the board was far from neutral. There were subtle imbalances, minor placements that didn't align perfectly, remnants of human unpredictability. These were the echoes of manipulation, residual effects that no confession, arrest, or statement could entirely resolve. Parker, watching his mentor, broke the silence. "Do you think it's truly over, sir? They're behind bars, the evidence is secured, the confessions recorded. Isn't that enough?" Whimsey shook his head slowly, his gaze distant yet focused. No, Parker. Even when the principal actors are constrained, the consequences of their manipulation ripple outward. People change, habits are altered, suspicions linger. A minor detail overlooked, an offhand comment, a subtle habit, a cryptic note, can trigger a sequence of events entirely unexpected. Justice, as we have administered it, addresses the overt actions. But the subtle currents of human behavior persist beyond confinement. This is the perpetual challenge of our work. The visible resolution is never the entire truth. H.E. retrieved the note that had arrived the previous evening, the elegant cryptic script reminding him that the game extends beyond the immediately visible players. Whimsey examined it closely once more. The words were polite, deliberate, and disquieting. Consider carefully the final pieces, for the game is never truly complete. It was a reminder that in human affairs, no pattern, however meticulously reconstructed, can account for every variable. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. It was Abernathy, summoned for a final debrief, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering unease. Whimsey observed the young clerk carefully. Though he had survived the psychological strain orchestrated by Lady Chard and had witnessed Halstead's opportunistic interference, there remained subtle tremors in his posture, faint hesitations in his speech. Human behavior, Whimsey thought, is rarely fully corrected by exposure alone. "Mr. Abernathy," Whimsey said gently, motioning for the young man to sit, "you have endured manipulations that would unsettle many. Yet you have provided crucial testimony and observations. I must ask, have you noticed anything that still seems out of place?" Abernathy paused, fingers fidgeting with the edge of his coat. "There is one thing, sir, a small detail I didn't think important at the time. When I first saw Lady Chard in the drawing-room before Edward Chard's death, I noticed a faint scent, something floral, almost medicinal, that I couldn't identify. It seemed to linger even when she left the room. I thought it irrelevant then, but now I'm not sure." Whimsey's eyes narrowed, tracing the mental map of events. The scent, the subtle anomaly, could have been overlooked deliberately, or accidentally. He noted the timing, the placement, the potential implications. It was minor, yet in a case defined by subtle manipulations, no detail was insignificant. "Thank you, Abernathy," Whimsey said, his tone calm but insistent. "Keep that in mind. Some details, though small, may yet reveal connections we have not fully understood." After Abernathy departed, Parker watched Whimsey as he returned to the chessboard. The room was still suffused with the soft light of late morning, yet the tension of unfinished threads lingered. "So there may be more?" Parker asked. "Perhaps," Whimsey replied, arranging the remaining pieces thoughtfully. "The visible manipulators have been accounted for, but life does not proceed in neat patterns. There may be those who observed, who learned, who retain knowledge we have not yet encountered. And even if no further crime emerges, the subtle residual effects of Lady Chard's and Halstead's interventions will echo in behavior, decisions, and perception. A mystery, once introduced into human affairs, is never truly erased." He stood by the window, looking down at the quiet street below. A woman hurried past, carrying a basket of groceries, unaware of the psychological intricacies that had played out in Belhaven, unaware that subtle manipulations and opportunistic interventions had shaped events she could never fully know. Whimsey's gaze lingered on her, then shifted to the fog curling along the edges of the pavement. Somewhere, perhaps nearby, the next mystery was gestating, an event waiting for the keen observer to notice the first subtle disturbance. Parker, sensing the weight of his mentor's thought, said quietly, "It seems we'll never truly leave these cases behind, will we?" Whimsey allowed a faint smile, one that held both amusement and the satisfaction of knowing that observation, patience, and intellect would always provide insight where others saw only confusion. "No, Parker. That is the nature of human complexity. Every revealed pattern, every confessed motive, and every resolved anomaly is merely the preparation for the next game. The mystery never ends. It only awaits the eye trained to perceive it." He returned to the chessboard. fingertips brushing the pieces as if contemplating moves yet to be played. Each remaining pawn, though seemingly minor, represented human actions shaped by influence, chance, and choice. The invisible patterns lingered, subtle yet potent, ready to be discerned by a mind prepared to notice the smallest deviation. As they prepared to leave Belhaven, Wimsey paused at the door, looking once more over the city. The fog had thickened, wrapping London in a cloak of uncertainty and possibility. Somewhere beyond the immediate resolution, other threads awaited discovery, other manipulations, other hidden motives, other shadows. The case of Lady Chard and Halstead was closed in the eyes of the law, yet in the intricate landscape of human behavior, mysteries always remained, unresolved, and waiting for a discerning mind. And with that, Peter, Wimsey, and Parker stepped into the streets, leaving behind the site of their most recent triumph, yet carrying with them the quiet certainty that wherever the smallest irregularity, the faintest anomaly, or the subtlest pattern appeared, the detective's eye would be ready to follow it, proving once more that while justice may be served, the true puzzle of human behavior is never fully complete.